My guest at this time is Casey Diaz. He is a former gang leader who was sent to prison for killing a rival gang member in the Los Angeles area. While in prison, he accepted Christ as his Savior, and his world dramatically changed. He is also the author now of The Shot Caller, which tells his story. And Casey, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on your program.
Well, this is just an amazing transformation. So let's begin at the beginning of your story. I believe you came to this country at a very young age, around 2 years old, and pretty much from the get-go was a very difficult home life, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And what was it like?
It starts off really very normal in an era where you still played outside, baseball, football, and just hung out with all your childhood friends. Except that in my apartment, there was an element that wasn't normal, and I knew that there was a problem. And that was because of, my father being an alcoholic and being violent and basically just never worked, just drank his whole life out, and then proceeded to beat my mom quite violently on a constant basis.
Sadly, it wasn't just in your home. There was also a lot of violence in your neighborhood. You witnessed a triple murder at age 8. What happened there?
We lived in the Rampart district of Los Angeles, and a lot of those older buildings kind of mimic the buildings of New York, where they have the fire escapes. And in this particular moment, it was midday, broad daylight, and I was hanging out on our third floor where we lived on the fire escape, and I was just sitting there, and my feet were dangling from the fire escape when a man parked his car and walked over to 3 individuals that were coming up an alley and gunned them down. And I saw the whole thing, and then he just very nonchalantly, just very without a hurry, got back into his car and drove off and left these 3 individuals to die there on that alley.
How did you get connected to gang life?
I think the lack of supervision. My mom, she worked very early in the morning, 4 in the morning, and wouldn't get home till like 10 at night. She always held, 2 jobs, sometimes 3. Sometimes she would bring her work home, and so there was her working, and then my father, being out on the streets and not paying attention to me had a lot to do with that. I think the lack of supervision. In that particular neighborhood, there was a lot of drugs being sold, and the gang environment, the uprise of the gang culture in Los Angeles just really hit hard.
And how did you rise through the ranks so quickly? Your book is entitled The Shot Caller, which means you had a lot of power inside this gang, certainly by the time you were 16. How did you advance through the ranks so quickly?
I think it has a lot to do with just the violence of, when you're witnessing so much violence, it becomes part of you, and it doesn't happen to everybody. I think choices are made, and, I saw kids that grew up making good choices in those type of environments, but for me, it was just different. I made some really unfortunate poor choices in life, and I think just that the violence that I saw affected me, and I took it out on rival gang members.
Tell us what happened when you were 16.
At 16, I was at a little local burger joint in L.A., and this is a time where you could be in a truck back in the 80s, where you could ride on the back of the bed of the truck, and I was what we called caught slipping by a rival gang who came into the little restaurant. Fight ensued, and I had a vehicle outside, and unfortunately there was a shotgun under the seat of that car, and the first guy that came at me with a crowbar, unfortunately I ended up ending his life there.
So you were convicted, and how long were you sentenced to prison for?
For almost 13 years. And, at that time, they weren't giving out big, lengthy sentences for some reason, especially if you were a juvenile. But at the same time, they were trying juveniles in the early stages of trying juveniles as adults. And so I got arrested in that little time frame where they started to do that.
So being arrested and sentenced to prison is a major life change, but that's not what changed you. What was your life like initially in prison?
I was supposed to serve out my whole entire sentence in what's called the SHU program in solitary confinement. And it was in there that a little Baptist church and a little lady by the name of Frances Proctor, who would come in there just once a month, and she would come in and share the gospel in there. And initially, I didn't want anything to do with that, and I let her know that. I was very respectful. I wasn't angry or anything like that with her, but I wasn't interested in. She had the boldness of a lion, this lady, and I remember her telling me, I'm gonna pray for you, and Jesus is gonna use you, and I kind of just let that go, and but then she asked me if I was okay with her stopping by my cell when they came once a month, and for the next year and 6 months, she would continually come over and just I would spend maybe 2 to 4 minutes with her, and she was just giving me the love of Christ and talking to me, and I had an experience inside that cell in which I speak with in full details in my book, the Shot Caller. But she was the initial lady that would her intercessory prayer is what worked.
So talk about that moment. Had she explained the gospel to the point where it suddenly clicked in your mind? Was it just the fact that she didn't give up on you? Her prayer, as you mentioned, what was it that struck you the moment you had that moment in the cell?
I think the consistency and the boldness, and there was something so authentic about her her concern for inmates in there, and and for some reason she just zeroed in on my life, and some of the CEOs there, the correctional officers there, even discouraged her initially to even approaching myself. So her courage was, I think it was just a mixture of her caring heart and everything else that went with it. But absolutely, it was the prayer that did all the work, for sure.
How did that change your life from that point on?
Well, I had to make a life-changing decision in which I turned my life over to Christ, and as a gang leader in there, and you're in a 4-yard in solitary confinement, to step down from a gang at that particular time becomes a danger to your own life. And I knew the risk, and I knew everything that it entailed, but I knew that I needed to do this, and something had happened in my heart that there was no way of denying it. And so in the book again, I talk about this. But I stepped down, and at that point, my life was in danger for the following 2 years that I was in there, in that unit.
Because of other gang members who were incarcerated as well?
Yeah, when you become a gang leader inside of a prison like that, you're not to step out. And if you dare step out, I mean, that's what happens in CDC, in the California Department of Corrections, is a green light is put on your life, and your life is required as of that moment. And if your gang is big enough or organized enough, they'll send one of your very own to do the work. And for me, that was the case. So they sent some of my very own gang members to do a hit on my life. And by the grace of God, He covered me. But I did go through a lot of persecution in there, and I was okay with that. I didn't. It didn't bother me in the sense that, what do you have to complain to God about at that point? You've wrecked people's lives, and you've made a mess out of your own. So if this is part of, it was very early in my stage of my Christian faith. I didn't understand the concepts of it, but I just knew that God had changed my heart, and I was willing to do whatever it was that I needed to do to stay on this path.
When did you get out of prison, and what did you do after that?
I got out in July 3rd, 95 is when I got out. And I immediately, I wasn't expected to get out that early as well. there was still 4 years hanging over my head. And but I was let out. I moved. I didn't tell any of my former gang members or anything like that. I completely separated myself, and I moved out to a little city where I didn't know anybody and nobody knew me. I didn't tell nobody I was getting out, and I think that helped me. And then I sought out to look for a local church, and God provided a small church for me to go to. I plugged into it, and here we are 24 or 25 years later. I know that when you have a lifestyle like that, it's very important to separate yourself from absolutely everybody, at least for a long season, until you mature and you grow and you give yourself, wholeheartedly to the local church to keep yourself accountable to people. And I found a job out here, God's hand has just really been upon my life ever since.
How do you use your story to encourage others, whether they come from a gang background or just others who are struggling in some other way in life?
Well, right now I'm on a book tour for the Shot Caller, and I go throughout the United States sharing my story on TV and radio and different types of platforms. It's a simple message that no matter how far you think you've gone, you're never out of the radar of God's, saving power. He's there and he's ready to save. In fact, he and this is what makes Christianity so vital and so unique, is that in every religion, there's man trying to reach God, and in Christianity, it's the exact opposite. It's God trying to reach man, no matter how far they have gone out. And that's what happened to me. And I try to, keep it simple by sharing my story, and my hope and my prayer is that as many as hear my testimony, that they would come to Christ as well. And that's really the reason why we wrote the book, The Shot Caller.
A couple of questions that I'm sure you're getting from other interviewers as well. Gang problem is still a major problem, whether it's coming in some cases from Latin America, or whether it's domestic. We hear about killings in Chicago all the time. We also see MS-13 and other gang members perpetrating horrific crimes, whether it's in the Washington, D.C. area or elsewhere. What's your insight? I'm sure you've thought about this, about the best ways to help prevent kids from going into gangs and also to prevent the ones who are coming into the country from getting here in the first place.
Well, I speak in very. I think I use my platform very loudly in this sense, because I know the problems that can come with illegal crossing of the border. I was just on Laura Ingraham not too long ago speaking on this. It's important to secure the borders from illegals coming in here and destroying low-income communities. When they come here, they're not coming to, nice suburbs. They're coming to low-income communities. And, crime is bound to happen in that. And then we have the problem with, domestic gangs that have been here for a long time. So it's absolutely a problem, a current problem, and anything that needs to be done to prevent it, to stop it, or to slow it down, I think is needed. And with our current administration, I think they're doing a wonderful job in securing the border and everything else that they're doing to make sure that American lives are saved.
Last question I have to ask: after you got out of prison, did you find Frances Proctor again?
Yes, I actually surprised her. I went to her church, and it's it's a little black church in South Central Los Angeles. I surprised them. I walked in there, and it was just an uproar of cheer because I didn't tell her, and she was actually her and the small prison ministry that went and helped me while I was in there. They were at my wedding as well. So she's been my mother in the Lord ever since, and just a wonderful lady of God, and I owe her immensely in her being obedient and and approaching myself that very day.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story of a transformed life. Casey, thank you so much for sharing it, and thank you very much for your time today. Best of luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
Casey Diaz, the book is The Shot Caller. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.